On a quiet autumn morning in 1983, a man stepped onto a small fishing boat along the coast of Florida. He waved to the dockmaster, untied the rope, and slowly drifted into the open water. A few hours later, the boat was found floating alone. The engine was still running. The man was gone. Authorities assumed the obvious. A tragic accident. Maybe he slipped. Maybe the current pulled him under. The ocean has a way of swallowing answers. But something about the scene didn't sit right with the investigators, because the man who vanished that morning had spent the previous 6 months quietly erasing himself from the world. His name was Richard MacDonald, and according to every official record, Richard MacDonald died at sea in 1983. Except he didn't. For nearly 30 years, the man everyone believed was dead lived quietly in another state under a completely different identity. He worked normal jobs, paid rent, spoke to neighbors, built a life, and no one, not police, not friends, not even his own family, had any idea that the man they buried at sea was still walking around somewhere in America. The story begins in a small coastal town where Richard had lived most of his life. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. If you met him in the grocery store, you probably wouldn't remember his face 5 minutes later. But people who knew him described him the same way. Quiet, reserved, private. He worked as a mechanic, fixing boat engines and small marine equipment. It was steady work. Nothing glamorous, but enough to keep the bills paid. And for years his life followed a predictable rhythm. Work during the day. A drink at the same bar most evenings. Then home. But sometime in the early 1980s, something shifted. Friends noticed small changes. Richard began withdrawing from social circles. He stopped visiting familiar places. He became unusually cautious with money. And most strangely of all, he began selling off pieces of his life. Furniture, old tools, personal belongings. At first, people assumed he was preparing to move, but no moving truck ever arrived. Instead, Richard seemed to be slowly dismantling his existence, one item at a time. Then, 6 months before his disappearance, he closed his bank account. No explanation. Just walked into the bank one afternoon, withdrew the remaining balance in cash, and left. From that moment on, Richard MacDonald was operating completely outside the financial system. No bank records, no paper trail, no digital footprint. Then came the morning of October 12, 1983. Richard arrived at the marina shortly after sunrise. A dock worker later recalled that he seemed calm, not nervous, not rushed, just focused. He untied his small fishing boat and headed out alone. About 2 hours later, a passing vessel spotted the empty boat drifting near a stretch of shallow water. The engine idled quietly. No signs of struggle, no damage, no blood, no life jacket. Just an empty boat rocking gently on the waves. The Coast Guard launched a search that lasted nearly 2 days. Helicopters scanned the coastline. Divers searched nearby waters. Nothing was found. No body, no debris, no clues. Eventually, authorities concluded the most likely explanation. Richard must have slipped or fallen overboard. The ocean had taken him. His family held a small memorial service weeks later. Friends shared stories. People grieved. And slowly, life moved on. Another tragic accident lost to the sea. But what investigators didn't know at the time was that Richard MacDonald had already traveled nearly 700 miles away, under a new name, in a different state, starting an entirely new life. The first real crack in the story appeared decades later, not from police, not from investigators, but from a routine identity check at a hospital in Arkansas. A man named James Sullivan had arrived for a minor medical procedure. He was in his late 60s, quiet, polite, the kind of patient who barely spoke during intake interviews. But when hospital staff ran his identification through a verification system, something unusual appeared. The Social Security number he had been using didn't match any official records. At first, administrators assumed it was a simple clerical error. But when they ran the check again, the result was the same. No matching identity, which meant one of two things. Either the number was fake, or the man using it didn't officially exist. Local authorities were notified. And what began as a routine paperwork issue quickly turned into something much stranger, because the man known as James Sullivan had been living in that town for over 20 years. He rented a small house, worked various maintenance jobs, paid taxes, spoke casually with neighbors. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He lived like any other quiet resident, except none of his documents could be verified. When investigators questioned him, he offered a simple explanation. He had lost most of his identification years ago during a move. It sounded plausible, but something about his behavior raised suspicion. He answered questions carefully, almost too carefully, like someone who had rehearsed every sentence, so authorities dug deeper. They searched for older records, employment forms, utility bills, rental agreements. Slowly, a strange pattern emerged. Before the early 1990s, there was absolutely no trace of James Sullivan anywhere. No school records, no birth certificate, no tax history. It was as if he had simply appeared out of thin air one day in a small Arkansas town. That's when investigators did something unexpected. They ran his fingerprints through a national database, and within seconds, the computer returned a match. But the name attached to those fingerprints wasn't James Sullivan. It was Richard MacDonald, a man who had supposedly died in a boating accident nearly 3 decades earlier. The discovery stunned investigators, because it meant one thing was suddenly clear. Richard MacDonald hadn't drowned in the ocean. He had walked away. When authorities confronted him with the evidence, the quiet man sitting in the interview room didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed, the kind of long, tired sigh that comes from carrying a secret for far too long. And then he began to talk.